In May of 1945, the Third Reich ceased to exist. Berlin was in ruins, Hitler was dead, and the German surrender was imminent. In that scenario of absolute collapse, not only the leaders faced their end, so did their wives. Enclosed in bunkers, mansions, and improvised shelters, they were trapped in the final chapter of the regime that had dominated Europe for more than 1 decade. The power to which they had been attached disappeared overnight, leaving only uncertainty and an inevitable outcome. What decisions marked their final hours? What led these women to face the end in such an extreme way? How do their destinies reflect the total downfall of Nazism? Eva Braun had remained in the shadows for more than a decade. Her identity was practically unknown to most Germans, and her relationship with Hitler was kept in a private realm, without presence in the public sphere or in the official structure of the regime. From the Berghof residence, she led a life of comfort, dedicated to photography and away from any political prominence. Hitler had cultivated the image of a leader without visible sentimental ties, with the aim of maintaining his appeal among sectors of the female population. The situation began to change as the Third Reich approached its collapse. In November of 1944, Braun decided to settle in Berlin to accompany Hitler in the final months. The move coincided with the German retreat on the Eastern Front and with the preparation of the capital to resist the Soviet siege. In January of the following year, Hitler left his headquarters in East Prussia and returned to Berlin after an overnight trip on a special train, convinced by Martin Bormann that the defense needed to be concentrated in the capital. Shortly after, he underwent surgery on his vocal cords, which forced him to communicate in writing for several days. In parallel, Eva Braun discreetly settled on the second floor of the Chancellery, while beneath the rear garden, the bunker that would serve as the last refuge had been completed. Braun's initial stay in the capital was brief, but in mid-January of 1945, she returned accompanied by her sister Gretel and escorted by members of Hitler's inner circle. From then on, she remained constantly at the Chancellery. In February, she turned 33 in an environment marked by aerial devastation. The American bombings destroyed large areas of the government district, causing thousands of casualties and leaving tens of thousands of Berliners homeless. Despite the destruction, the celebration took place in the private quarters of the Chancellery with a small group of attendees. Among them was Karl Brandt, former personal physician of Hitler, who shortly thereafter would be accused of treason and removed from his position. As the weeks went by, Eva Braun consolidated her presence in the Führer's inner circle. She shared spaces with figures like Bormann and Goebbels, and her influence was reflected in critical comments towards some collaborators. At the beginning of February, she temporarily left the capital, but in March she returned permanently after saying goodbye to her surroundings in Munich. By then, the Allied troops had crossed the Rhine and the Soviets were advancing through Pomerania. The military situation was irreversible, although Hitler continued to proclaim the arrival of secret weapons and the possibility of counter-offensives. In March, he signed the so-called Scorched Earth Order, which instructed the destruction of any infrastructure that could be used by the enemy. The measure was not fully implemented thanks to the intervention of Albert Speer. Meanwhile, in the bunker, night meetings took place that combined military reports with trivial conversations, a contrast that reflected the distance between the reality of the front and the underground life of the Nazi leadership. Braun, for her part, maintained an appearance of normalcy by organizing small private gatherings and showing serenity in the face of the imminence of the outcome. In April, with the Soviet artillery already audible from the center of the city, Eva Braun continued to refuse to evacuate. She practiced with the weapon she carried with her, maintained her personal appearance, and demanded that Hitler keep his composure. On the 20th, the Führer's last birthday was celebrated in the bunker, attended by the main hierarchs of the regime. Shortly after, Braun gathered secretaries and officers for a small, improvised celebration in an attempt to maintain morale. 2 days later, when Hitler exploded in anger upon learning about the failure of Steiner's counterattack, Eva remained by his side and rejected any suggestion to leave the capital. In those same days, Hitler began to distribute poison capsules among his closest collaborators. The compound, based on prussic acid, caused death in a matter of seconds. The nightly conversations revolved exclusively around the end. Braun assured that she would die with Hitler, leaving no room for capture by the enemy. On the 28th of April, Himmler's betrayal by negotiating with the Allies and the capture of Hermann Fegelein, Eva's brother-in-law, precipitated the events. Fegelein was summarily executed after being accused of desertion. That same night, Hitler dictated to his secretary Traudl Junge his political and personal testament. In it, he included the justification for his marriage to Eva Braun, arguing that after years of cohabitation, the relationship should be formalized in their final hours. The civil ceremony was held in the bunker with Goebbels and Bormann present as witnesses. Afterwards, there was a brief toast in an atmosphere laden with solemnity. The Union, far from marking a new beginning, sealed the shared end. The following day, Hitler ordered the poison to be tested on his dog Blondie. The result confirmed the final decision. On the 30th of April, with the Soviet forces reaching the Reichstag, Hitler and Eva Braun retired to their rooms. There she ingested the cyanide capsule and he shot himself in the temple. Their bodies were transported to the Chancellery Garden, doused with gasoline and burned according to previous instructions. The remains were buried improvisedly in a bomb crater, amidst a Berlin reduced to ruins. In the summer of 1944, when the defeat of the Third Reich was already shaping up as inevitable, the Goebbels family still maintained a certain normalcy in the country residence of Lanka. There, far from the bombings and the front, Magda took refuge with her 6 children. The atmosphere on the estate offered an apparent calm, sustained by school routines and outdoor games, although this tranquility was fragile and depended on ignoring the news that arrived by radio and press. The children grew up in an orderly environment under the supervision of a governess chosen by Magda, described as discreet and efficient, who would remember years later the discipline of that house without adding political judgments. The children were considered well-behaved and affectionate. Helga, the eldest, was approaching adolescence and beginning to notice tensions that the younger ones could not understand. Helmut, the only boy, stood out for a withdrawn character that worried his father. Joseph Goebbels reacted harshly when a school report indicated a poor performance, although Magda intervened to support him and, with the help of the governess, managed to improve the child. In the domestic sphere, Joseph was enthusiastic, even provocative, seeking challenging responses from his children, although his excesses sometimes resulted in sudden anger. Magda maintained a more serene tone, taking care of practical tasks and keeping a cordial relationship with the staff, even though in private she suffered episodes of tension reflected in a compulsive need to reorganize the house. During those months, Magda alternated stays in Lanka with trips to Berlin. The bond with Joseph remained close, despite the evident strain on the relationship. At the estate, she received visits from her friend Elo Quant and her mother, whose presence, laden with anguish, increased the emotional pressure. The domestic routine was maintained, and the children celebrated birthdays with small handmade gifts, while the adults avoided talking about the impending outcome. At the end of January 1945, with the displaced advancing westward and the Soviet encirclement tightening, the family left Lanka and moved to Schwanenwerder, on the banks of the Havel. There, for a few weeks, spring gave the illusion of continuity, although the echoes of the Eastern artillery were already audible. In April, when the capital was practically surrounded, Magda was ordered to move the children to Berlin. Even with routes blocked and under constant risk, the caravan reached the Chancellery. It was the beginning of their final confinement. On the 25th of April, Hitler offered Magda and her children the possibility of leaving the city. He insisted that there was still time to escape, but she refused without hesitation. Shortly after, Erich Kempka prepared an armored convoy bound for Gatow, where a plane was ready to take off. Magda seemed to hesitate for a moment, but Joseph's presence dissolved any hesitation. She confirmed that they would remain together until the end. In those days, Hannah Reich arrived at the bunker after completing a risky flight. Magda's children, curious and lively, surrounded her with questions. Reich responded with stories and songs to distract them from the siege. Those who observed them were surprised by the serenity of the little ones, always well-dressed and proper, despite the collapse unfolding on the surface. The soldiers present wondered why they were not evacuated. Meanwhile, Joseph Goebbels rejected any negotiation options and sought to give his own death a propagandistic meaning. Magda assumed that decision as her own. Later testimonies indicated that both had agreed on their fate weeks before, convinced that there was no possible life beyond the fall of Hitler. Magda's conviction was reinforced by personal beliefs in reincarnation, which, according to those who knew her, served as an intimate justification. On April 29, Goebbels drafted a statement in which he expressed that for the first time he disobeyed an order of the Führer by refusing to leave Berlin. He stated that his wife and children shared that decision, and that to die with Hitler was, in his words, the most dignified way to serve Germany. That same day, Hitler appointed him Reich Chancellor, a practically empty title, but symbolically relevant for someone who had been one of his most loyal collaborators. Upon bidding farewell to Magda, he gave her the Golden Party Badge, a gesture that moved her deeply. Hours later, Magda wrote a letter to her eldest son, Harold, who was outside Berlin. In it, she explained that the world that was coming made no sense for the family and that, therefore, she had decided to take the children with her. She emphasized that they endured the confinement with serenity, even managing to bring smiles to Hitler during his daily visits, and asked her son to always remember with honor the family origin. The execution of the 6 children occurred shortly after. The testimonies differ on the details. According to some accounts, they were sedated with morphine and poisoned with cyanide capsules while they slept. Other sources suggest that Helga, the eldest, attempted to resist, and her corpse showed signs consistent with a struggle. Ludwig Stumpfegger, an SS doctor, and Helmut Kunz, a dental assistant, participated in the procedure. The latter stated after the war that he applied the injections but denied administering the poison, pointing to Magda and Stumpfegger as directly responsible. When Magda left the room after the act, her face showed the impact, although she maintained an external calm that surprised those present. That same night, while the final escape of the staff was being organized, Magda and Joseph ascended the stairs of the bunker to the Chancellery Garden. They refused to receive help. There, Joseph shot himself and Magda ingested poison. Their bodies were doused with gasoline and set on fire, although the combustion was incomplete. The remains were found by the Soviets when they occupied the capital on the 2nd of May. In the same place, the bodies of Helga, Hildegard, Helmut, Hedwig, Holdin, and Heidrun, aged between 4 and 12 years, were recorded by Soviet troops. The image of the 6 bodies lined up inside the bunker became one of the most direct testimonies of fanaticism and the irreversible consequences of the collapse of the regime. In the spring of 1945, while in Berlin, the last days of the Nazi regime were unfolding in the south of Germany, Emmy Goering's life was undergoing a drastic turn. On the 21st of April, she was anxiously awaiting her husband's return at an Alpine residence. Hermann Goering, still formally in charge of the Luftwaffe, had traveled to the Eastern Front and returned that same night. The family reunion was brief. Their daughter, Edda, was sleeping unaware of the situation, while her father described the country's state of devastation. Hitler had sent him to Berchtesgaden, but doubts about the immediate future became clearly apparent. On the 23rd of April, the news that changed the course of the family arrived. General Koller communicated that in the Berlin bunker, Hitler had insinuated that Goering should assume the leadership of the Reich. Hermann clung to the decree signed in 1941 that designated him as successor in case of incapacitation and sent a message requesting authorization. In case of no response, he said, he would act on his own initiative. The reply arrived that same afternoon. The decree was rendered void and he was prohibited from any initiative. Shortly after, SS units placed Goering under custody in his own residence. Emmy understood that the circle had definitively closed. The surveillance was strict. Emmy and Hermann could barely speak for a few minutes under the constant watch of armed guards. When the air raid alarm sounded, they took refuge with their daughter in improvised basements that offered barely any safety. In one of those descents, Hermann took Edda in his arms and assured her that as long as they stayed together, she should not be afraid. The family survived on the fringes of a regime that was collapsing, surrounded by soldiers who obeyed contradictory orders. In the following days, the confirmation arrived that Hitler was accusing him of treason and was removing him from all his positions. Emmy watched incredulously the downfall of the man who had been the second most powerful person in the regime. There were even threats of execution that included the entire family and domestic staff. 3 servants then demanded to share the fate of their masters. a gesture of loyalty that surprised Goering himself. Finally, the order was given to transfer to Mautendorf Castle in Austria, a former family property with a gloomy appearance. Emmy insisted on not being separated from her husband and managed to accompany him. The confinement in Mautendorf brought a momentary respite. The alpine air and the presence of occasional Luftwaffe allies mitigated the threat of execution. A passage discovered in the castle allowed the family to contact officers who persuaded the SS not to carry out the death order. The tension persisted, but the imminence of catastrophe was diluted. On the 1st of May, a hidden radio broadcast the news of Hitler's suicide. Deprived of any possibility of reconciling with him, Goering fell into a state of dejection. Emmy tried to support him by feigning an ailment, a strategy that forced him to focus on her and diverted him from despair. On the 7th of May, the awaited message arrived. They were free. A few days later, they set off on the journey to Zell am See. During the trip, they passed through villages in ruins and encountered remnants of exhausted German troops. In Radstadt, Luftwaffe units surrounded the car and greeted the Reich Marshal with enthusiasm, an evident contrast to his somber demeanor. Minutes later, an American detachment appeared, and an officer named Stack communicated that Eisenhower agreed to receive him. The family was housed in Fischhorn Castle. That night, a soldier tersely informed Emmy that the war was over. She cried with relief. The next day, Goering set off for his meeting with the Americans. Emmy bid him farewell with the promise not to leave his side, but she sensed it was a final goodbye. Shortly afterward, she suffered partial paralysis in her arm, a physical effect of the emotional collapse. Edda, still a child, asked if Germany had won the war. Her mother told her the truth. The girl reacted with disappointment, though she assured she would be brave. On June 2nd, Edda turned 7 years old in an environment marked by records, suspicions, and accusations. Emmy endured the confusion while awaiting news of her husband, imprisoned in Nuremberg. In October 1946, she received information that Hermann had committed suicide in his cell the day before his execution. For her, it was no surprise. She repeated that he had fulfilled the promise not to let himself be hanged. The hardest blow came when delivering the news to her daughter. Edda interpreted that an angel had delivered the poison to her father, and her mother did not dispel that fantasy. Emmy lost almost everything that had defined her life: properties, status, and stability. She was arrested, ill, and separated from her daughter at various times. In the denazification processes, she was reproached more for her marital loyalty than for concrete actions. She summed it up in one sentence: "The only thing they could condemn me for was having loved my husband." Over time, her existence was reduced to austerity and survival. She continued writing letters to Hermann as if he were still present and turned her attention to Edda, who became her only reason for living. In the following years, she learned to accept that happiness and pain were not opposites, but inseparable realities that defined her path. Gerda Buch was born in 1909 into a family closely linked to German nationalism. Her father, Walter Buch, presided over the Court of Honor of the National Socialist Party, an organ in charge of judging internal infractions and preserving discipline among militants. From a young age, she was surrounded by a rigid political environment where adherence to the movement was understood as an absolute moral conviction. This family environment paved the way for her future connection with Martin Bormann, who at that time was the personal secretary of Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy. The marriage was held in September of 1929, with Adolf Hitler and Rudolf Hess as witnesses. That gesture was not only symbolic, it reflected the couple's closeness to the foundational core of the party. Over time, Gerda and Martin had 10 children, raised in an environment of strict ideological discipline and under the conviction that they represented the future of the Reich. The letters Gerda sent to her husband, when he was absent, reveal a firm commitment to the National Socialist doctrine and an explicit disdain towards those who did not conform to the racial canons proclaimed by the regime. Family life took place in Obersalzberg, in the vicinity of Hitler's residence. The area had become an exclusive enclave, with housing for the leaders closest to the Führer, security facilities, and recreational spaces controlled by the SS. The Bormann family lived in a spacious house that functioned as a domestic center, but also as a meeting point for party guests. From there, Gerda oversaw the children's education, reinforcing the regime's ideological values, while Martin ascended in the power hierarchy. Bormann's career advanced rapidly. After accompanying Hess, he went on to lead the party chancellery, an organization that centralized the relationship between the NSDAP structure and the state. His control extended to appointments, sanctions, and resource distribution. Later, he became Hitler's personal secretary, a position from which he controlled the agenda, access, and documentation that reached the leader. This discreet but decisive role gave him considerable influence, comparable to that of ministers and military chiefs, although he rarely appeared in public. Gerda adapted to that situation with enthusiasm. She participated in the women's circles of the regime and maintained close contact with the wives of other leaders. In her correspondence, she wholeheartedly supported the Reich's harsher policies, including the radicalization of anti-Semitic measures and the extermination program. She was not limited to a domestic role. Her writings show ideological conviction and total loyalty to her husband's political project. When the war began to turn, Martin spent more and more time in Hitler's headquarters, especially in the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia and later in Berlin. Gerda was in charge of the children and the properties in Bavaria, although she always supported her husband's decisions by letter. The proximity of the front and the bombings made life in Obersalzberg unsustainable at the beginning of 1945. The family decided to evacuate to the south of Germany, following the crowded routes of refugees fleeing the Allied advance. During that journey, Gerda began to show signs of illness. Intense pain, weakness, and weight loss worsened until field doctors confirmed an irreversible diagnosis: advanced stage uterine cancer. In a devastated country, there were no medical resources capable of reversing it. The reports were clear: she had only a few months to live. While she dealt with the illness, Martin remained in Berlin with Hitler in the last days of the bunker. On the 1st of May 1945, he left the shelter accompanied by Arthur Axmann and SS officers. According to Axmann's later account, he died that same night due to the explosion of a Soviet projectile near the Lehrter Bahnhof station. However, his body was not found, which generated uncertainty that lasted for decades. Gerda, settled with her children in Bavaria, faced the absence of concrete news. Some rumors claimed that Martin had managed to escape and cross enemy lines. Others asserted that he had been captured by the Soviets and taken to prisoner camps. There were even versions that placed him in South America, linking him with the escape networks that were beginning to form for former Nazi leaders, later known as Odessa. The lack of confirmation fueled her hope of reunion. Meanwhile, her health was deteriorating rapidly. The combination of a terminal illness, material hardship, and the responsibility of caring for 10 children turned her daily life into a constant struggle. Despite this, she clung to the belief that Martin was still alive somewhere and that they would reunite. This belief sustained her until her death in March of 1946 at 36 years old. She died convinced that the separation was only temporary. After his death, the children were distributed among convents, institutions, and distant relatives. The subsequent paths reflected divergent responses to the family legacy. Some retained the inherited ideology, while others completely distanced themselves. One of them, Martin Bormann Jr., was ordained a Catholic priest and publicly defended positions contrary to those of his parents, an example of the internal fracture that marked the descendants of the Nazi leaders. The figure of Martin Bormann remained present in the Nuremberg trials, where he was sentenced to death in absentia in October of 1946. His name remained on the lists of wanted criminals for decades. The absence of definitive evidence allowed contradictory versions and survival theories to circulate, fueled by the Cold War and the emergence of clandestine networks of former Nazis in several countries. The uncertainty was partially resolved in 1972 when workers conducting excavations in Berlin found human remains near the Lehrter Bahnhof station, in the same place indicated by Arthur Axmann. Forensic studies of the time identified the bones as belonging to a middle-aged man, and an intact cyanide capsule was found among the remains, a usual indication among fleeing Nazi hierarchs. The German justice system officially declared Bormann dead, although doubts about the identification persisted due to the technical limitations of the time. It was not until 1998, with advancements in genetics, that DNA tests definitively confirmed that those remains belonged to Martin Bormann. The evidence established that he had died in Berlin on the night of the 1st of May 1945, a few hours after leaving the bunker. Gerda never knew. She died in uncertainty, convinced that one day she would see him again. Her life ended without certainties or a grave of her own, with 10 children scattered in a country in ruins and with a surname turned into a symbol of the regime's decline. The case of Martin Bormann was officially closed half a century later, but for his wife the story remained unfinished from the first day. Ilse Pröll was born in 1900 in Hanover into a middle-class family with a solid academic background. She studied history, German literature, and political science at the universities of Munich and Berlin. During those youthful years, she came into contact with nationalist associations and anti-Semitic circles, an expanding environment in the Weimar Republic after the German defeat in the First World War. In 1920, he met Rudolf Hess, then a disciple of Professor Karl Haushofer at the University of Munich. Haushofer was a retired military man who taught courses in geopolitics, and his ideas would decisively influence the concept of living space advocated by Nazism. The relationship between Ilse and Rudolf began as an intellectual affinity and developed into a sentimental commitment. In September of 1927, they got married. Since the wedding, Ilse became a close collaborator of her husband. Rudolf rose in the ranks of the National Socialist Party and became one of Hitler's most trusted men. His role as lieutenant placed him in the direct line of succession in case of the Führer's incapacity. Ilse projected herself publicly as his loyal wife, participated in social events linked to the party, and maintained correspondence with other leaders. Although she did not perform comparable political functions to those of other members of the circle, she was a constant support for Rudolf. She shared his convictions, openly defended anti-Semitism, and expressed in private letters her admiration for Hitler and for the fate of the Reich. The family grew with the birth of a son, Wolf Rüdiger, who became the center of her domestic life. On the 10th of May, 1941, the event occurred that would mark the rest of his existence. Rudolf Hess flew alone in a Messerschmitt 110 from Augsburg to Scotland. His objective was to contact British interlocutors and negotiate a separate peace that would end the confrontation between Germany and the United Kingdom. In his own view, both nations were natural allies against the Soviet threat. The mission was an immediate failure. Upon landing, he was arrested by the British authorities and confined to prison. Hitler reacted with fury, declared him mentally ill, and stripped him of all authority. Within a matter of hours, the second man of the Reich became an enemy prisoner and was out of the power structure. For Ilse, the blow was devastating. Overnight, she went from being the lieutenant to the Führer's wife to living in solitude under suspicion, with her son in charge and subjected to the scrutiny of the regime. Even so, she remained faithful to her ideological convictions and did not distance herself from the National Socialist cause. Her correspondence with Rudolf was subjected to British censorship and was reduced to brief and sporadic messages. With the German collapse in 1945, Ilse was detained by the Allies and interrogated about her knowledge of the Scotland flight. She denied having had prior information and claimed that the decision had been completely unilateral by her husband. In 1947, she appeared before a denazification commission. The court reviewed her correspondence, her contacts, and testimonies from third parties, concluding that she was a Mitläuferin, that is, a passive follower of the regime. That classification implied minor sanctions, temporary loss of assets, and professional restrictions, but prevented her from facing criminal charges. Settled in Bavaria after the process, she focused on raising Wolf Rüdiger. Meanwhile, Rudolf Hess was transferred to Nuremberg to be tried. In 1946, he was sentenced to life imprisonment for conspiracy and crimes against peace. Since 1947, he remained in Spandau prison in West Berlin under the joint custody of the four victorious powers. Spandau became a symbol of the Cold War. The 7 convicted prisoners were reduced over time until after successive releases and deaths, Rudolf Hess remained as the sole inmate. Ilse then began a persistent campaign to achieve his release. In interviews, memoirs, and public letters, she defended the version that her husband had acted driven by pacifist intentions and that the flight to Scotland had been a personal sacrifice for peace. During the post-war decades, he sent petitions to the governments of the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union. All were rejected. The official stance remained firm. Rudolf Hess had to serve his entire sentence, as his release would be interpreted as a gesture of leniency towards one of the main leaders of Nazism. Ilse's visits to Spandau were regulated with extreme rigidity. She could only see her husband at pre-established intervals, under military surveillance and with limited duration. Despite those conditions, she never ceased her support. Rudolf did not express remorse nor distance himself from the regime in conversations with his wife. That attitude reinforced in Ilse the idea that his conviction was a historical injustice. Over the years, the campaigns of Ilse and her son gained international notoriety. They claimed that for humanitarian reasons, Rudolf should be released due to his advanced age and precarious state of health. The argument was repeated in public forums, but it never succeeded. Spandau prison remained open exclusively to house a single prisoner. On August 17, 1987, Rudolf Hess was found dead in the prison garden. According to the official version, he had committed suicide by hanging himself with an electrical cable. He was 93 years old and had been in captivity for 46 years. The news immediately triggered the reaction of Ilse and Wolf Rudiger, who rejected the official version and claimed that he had been murdered by Allied agents to prevent his release. Ilse commissioned independent expert assessments and promoted parallel investigations. None managed to refute with solid evidence the version of suicide. However, she maintained until the end that her husband had been a victim of a conspiracy. In later interviews, she claimed that for years she had hoped for his release on humanitarian grounds and that this expectation was deliberately thwarted. Until her death in 1995, at the age of 95, Ilse invariably defended Rudolf's memory. She never acknowledged the legitimacy of Nuremberg nor her husband's criminal responsibility. She reiterated that his flight to Scotland had been a misunderstood peace mission, and that his prolonged imprisonment represented a political injustice rather than a judicial punishment. Ilse Hess dedicated more than half a century to that cause. Her life was defined by the endless wait for a husband who went from being one of the most powerful men in the Reich to a solitary prisoner in Spandau. When he died, her existence was closed, marked by the same loyalty she had shown from the beginning. The conviction that Rudolf Hess had been a peace emissary silenced by history. Lena Matilda von Osten was born in 1911 on the island of Fehmarn in the Baltic Sea. Her family belonged to the German middle class and maintained strong ties with the Prussian tradition. The defeat of 1918 and the conditions imposed by the Treaty of Versailles decisively marked her youth. She grew up in an environment in which resentment towards the post-war period and admiration for movements that promised to restore national honor were common. In 1929, at 18 years old, she attended a National Socialist Party rally in Hamburg. She listened to Adolf Hitler speak and was impressed by his oratory and his message of renewal. From then on, she declared herself a supporter of the movement and began to integrate into local organizations that orbited around the party. That early commitment largely defined her destiny. In December of 1930, she met Reinhard Heydrich at a dance organized by a rowing club in Kiel. Heydrich had recently been expelled from the German Navy due to a personal scandal that ended his military career. Lena was attracted by his demeanor, discipline, and ambition. Just weeks later, they got engaged. The speed with which they consolidated their relationship reflected the ideological compatibility and the need for both to reaffirm a common life project. The marriage was celebrated in 1931 with the presence of Heinrich Himmler. The leader of the SS had met Heydrich shortly before and immediately recognized his organizational skills. Lena's influence at that stage was decisive. She convinced him to join the SS after his forced departure from the Navy, which paved the way for his rise as head of the Reich Main Security Office. The couple had 4 children during the 1930s. They initially resided in Berlin, where Lena integrated into the social circles of the wives of senior officers, and later in a confiscated castle in Panenské Brezany on the outskirts of Prague after the German occupation of Czechoslovakia. The castle became a symbol of the power of Reinhard Heydrich as deputy protector of Bohemia and Moravia. Lena managed the residence with a very high standard of living, sustained by properties confiscated from Jewish families and Czech aristocrats. The The gardens, the service staff, and the comforts of the mansion showed the contrast between the prosperity of the family and the harshness of the occupation. During those years, Lena reinforced her position as a recognized social figure in the Nazi environment. She organized receptions, participated in charitable activities, and maintained contact with the wives of other leaders. Her letters and testimonies reflect ideological conviction and approval of the new order imposed by Germany in the occupied territories. The exact degree of knowledge she had about her husband's most criminal operations remains a subject of debate among historians, although it is undeniable that her domestic environment directly benefited from the policies of confiscation and persecution. On May 27, 1942, 2 Czech agents trained by the British services attacked Heydrich's car in Prague. The plan, known as Operation Anthropoid, sought to eliminate one of the most influential leaders of the Nazi security apparatus. The injuries caused by the explosives did not seem fatal at first, but the lack of adequate antibiotics and the resulting infections caused Heydrich's death on June 4th. Lena, at 31 years old, became the widow of one of the most feared men of the regime. Hitler ordered a state funeral in Berlin and presented him as a martyr of the Reich. The propaganda used his death to justify reprisals in Czechoslovakia, including massacres such as the destruction of the village of Lidice. After the funeral, Lena was reinstated in Panenské Breziny with a lifetime pension, domestic service, and properties maintained by the regime. During the rest of the war, she lived under that official protection and was presented as a symbol of marital sacrifice and fidelity to the National Socialist ideal. With the defeat of Germany in 1945, her situation changed radically. She was arrested by the Allied forces and transferred to internment camps. Her assets in Czechoslovakia were confiscated, and the new government of Prague sentenced her in absentia to life imprisonment as a beneficiary of the occupation regime. In Allied interrogations, she denied having had knowledge of her husband's criminal operations and maintained that Reinhard strictly separated his professional life from his family life. She was not tried as a war criminal in Germany due to lack of direct evidence. The authorities of the Federal Republic of Germany rejected her extradition to Czechoslovakia. She eventually settled in Fehmarn, her native island, where she raised her children and survived on limited resources. During the first years after the war, he avoided all public exposure. Over time, however, he began to actively defend Reinhard's memory. In interviews given from the 1960s onwards, he maintained that he had been unjustly demonized by the victors. He claimed that he had been a disciplined officer, executor of higher orders, and denied his direct involvement in the conception of the final solution. In 1976, he published his memoirs under the title Leben mit einem Kriegsverbrecher, Life with a War Criminal. The title suggested self-criticism, but the content denied the guilt of Heydrich in the crimes of the regime. The book presented her husband as a severe but fair man, dedicated to his family and to the fulfillment of duty. The work was harshly criticized by historians and journalists who pointed it out as an attempt at whitewashing. Even so, it found readers in far-right German and international sectors who considered Lena a respectable figure for her unwavering loyalty. In her personal life, she remarried in the 1960s to a Finnish theatre director, but was widowed again in 1969. That same year, the inn and restaurant she had set up in the old family home burned down, which she interpreted as a personal attack, although it was never proven to be arson. From then on, she resumed the surname Heydrich permanently. During the 1970s, he gave additional interviews in which he reiterated his exculpatory version. He never acknowledged Reinhard's central role in the Wannsee Conference or in the coordination of the Einsatzgruppen, despite the abundant documentation that placed him as one of the main architects of the genocide. Until the end, he defended the idea that he had been a victim of a smear campaign. Lena Heydrich died on the 14th of August of 1985 in Fehmarn at 74 years old. Until her last days, she maintained the conviction that her husband had been misunderstood by history. She never accepted the legitimacy of the accusations leveled against him, nor did she express any regret for the ideological convictions shared during her marriage. Margarete Boden was born in 1893 into a well-off family in northern Germany. She trained as a nurse and worked actively in the Red Cross during and after the First World War. Her social environment was marked by conservative and nationalist convictions, which naturally connected her with the circles of the National Socialist Party in the years of the Weimar Republic. In 1928, she married Heinrich Himmler, then a mid-ranking official in the party. The marriage was not well received by the Himmler family due to the age difference, the fact that Margaret had been previously married, and that she was Protestant. The relationship led to the birth of Gudrun in August of 1929. With Heinrich's rise to power as Reichsführer SS, Margareta gained considerable material privileges, including a residence in Gmünd am Tegernsee and access to a social network linked to the innermost core of the regime. Her public involvement focused on work with the German Red Cross, where she reached the rank of Oberschwester and oversaw military hospitals. Her private letters reveal openly anti-Semitic sympathies and ideological support for the regime, although there is no evidence that she knew in detail about the logistics of the deportations or the operation of the concentration camps. In April of 1945, when the Reich was collapsing, Margaret and her daughter moved toward southern Germany. They were arrested in Bolzano by American troops and transferred to internment camps. In the denazification processes of 1948, she was classified as activist and beneficiary. After several appeals, her case was downgraded to person implicated of minor degree in 1953. Her pension rights and voting participation were withdrawn, and she spent the rest of her life in Munich in discreet isolation. She passed away in 1967. Her daughter Gudrun maintained a public activity for decades in defense of her father's memory and support of former SS members. Elisabeth Speer, born Margareta Weber in 1905 in Heidelberg, followed a different path. She married in 1928 to Albert Speer, then a young architect who years later would become Minister of Armaments and a key figure in the war economy. Elizabeth devoted herself exclusively to domestic life, raising 6 children and managing the family home. During the regime, she avoided public exposure. She did not join National Socialist women's organizations, nor did she participate in official events. Her role was strictly private, and when Albert was tried in Nuremberg and sentenced to 20 years of imprisonment, she did not attend any sessions of the trial, nor did she make any public statements. During the 2 decades of her husband's imprisonment in Spandau, she maintained absolute silence, moving with her children between various cities and avoiding any media appearances. When Albert regained his freedom in 1966, he became a public figure through memoirs and interviews. Elizabeth, on the other hand, continued without giving a single statement. She never published testimonies nor sought to explain her experience as the wife of a Nazi minister. Her strategy was anonymity, and she maintained it until her death in 1980. Hedwig Hensel, wife of Rudolf Höss, commander of Auschwitz, had an exceptional experience. She married in 1929 and had 5 children. In 1940, the family moved to the villa built for the commander within the perimeter of the camp. The residence, with gardens and modern conveniences, was located just a few meters from the extermination facilities. The crematorium ovens were visible from the windows, and the smoke permeated the surroundings. Survivors' testimonies from those who worked in the house describe Hedwig as haughty and severe towards the prisoners employed as servants. The physical proximity to the extermination apparatus makes her later claim of not knowing what was happening in Auschwitz implausible. However, after the war, she was never prosecuted as a war criminal. Rudolf Höss was captured in 1946, tried in Krakow, and executed in Auschwitz in April of 1947. Hedwig was left a widow with 5 children and took refuge in anonymity. She changed her identity and moved to different regions to avoid exposure. She never granted interviews or published memoirs. She passed away in 1989 without publicly clarifying her degree of knowledge or moral responsibility. Käthe Dönitz represented the most extreme form of voluntary anonymity. Born in 1898, she married in 1916 to Karl Dönitz, a young naval officer who decades later would become commander of the Kriegsmarine, and, at the end of the war, Hitler's designated successor. Throughout her life, she maintained a strictly domestic profile. She raised 3 children and accompanied her husband on military transfers without getting involved in political activities. When Karl was arrested in May of 1945 and sentenced to 10 years in prison in Nuremberg, Käthe did not participate in public defense campaigns or give statements. She limited herself to maintaining private correspondence and making authorized visits in Spandau. After Karl's release in 1956, the couple settled in Aumühle in northern Germany. They lived in complete seclusion until Kerter's death in 1962. Their silence was absolute. They granted no interviews, published no memoirs, and left very few documentary traces about their personal life.